right. Well, I am very excited to be moderating this conversation. I think these are some of the things that I feel like I have the luxury of being privy to, having known both of you and knowing both your experiences, but it's rare to kind of, do this together and then also have it, sort of recorded and broadcast so people can start to understand and see, what this kind of conversation looks like. I think for me, I'm absolutely here just to kind of kick things off. I don't plan to be super active in this discussion, but we'll see. Maybe I'll jump in. And in the most meta of ways, I legitimately have an Uber Eats order on the way. So I will be jumping off to make
What about a Dutchie order?
Yeah, a Dutchie order. That's generally not what I do at 10 o'clock in the morning, but that's
they're supposed to go hand in hand.
Yeah, exactly.
Partnership waiting to happen.
But look, I'm super excited. I think what would be great just to kick it off is, Allen, would love the quick background and, your history at Uber Eats and, what you're doing now so people know. And then, Ross, really quickly as well. And then let's just get into it about what it takes to build, some incredibly compelling companies that touch millions and millions of customers. So Allen, why don't you start it off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Karan, and great to be here and hang out for a little bit. My name's Allen Penn. I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer at Verde. Verde operates in the on-demand healthcare technology space, essentially in-home, bringing mobile urgent care to people, as well as helping patients who are the sickest to have the least amount of access to healthcare to get that care in their home. So a bit of a gear change. Previously, I spent 7 years at Uber. I was the 25th employee there, joining back in 2011 in Chicago, and then spent the majority of my career with Uber in Asia between Singapore and Hong Kong, where Karan and I first met, spending time on Uber's rides business, building that out across the region, leading our entry, scaling, and ultimate exit to our competitor in China in an incredibly hyper-growth environment there, and then moved over to the Uber Eats business as it was beginning in 2016 in that region, built that region out, and then ran all of Uber Eats' global operations across the world for another year or so before I left Uber at the end of 2018. So lots of sort of different experiences in there, different stages of growth, different business units and geographies that we can chat about as Ross and I go through it today.
Very cool. Ross, maybe give the quick background before Dutchie and then just really quickly on what Dutchie does.
Yeah, so before Dutchie, I started in about 15 years ago in the online food ordering business in the States, focused primarily in university markets, very, very early on, first inning of online food ordering. Far before Uber was around, DoorDash, Postmates, it was Grubhub and a few others around back at that time. And I had a knack for the model, found some traction in the States, exited the group, which later sold to Grubhub, and moved to Canada to launch Grub Canada in 2008. Which was Canada's first online food ordering service. Fast forward 4 years, we sold Grub Canada to Just Eat. Funny enough, just as of lately, if any have seen in the news, Just Eat just bought Grubhub. So that kind of came full circle in a funny way. And from there, took a few years off, found myself back in the States in Oregon. Always been extremely passionate about cannabis and found an intersection of passion for cannabis meets experience in online food ordering, married the two, and outbirthed Dutchie, which is an e-commerce solution for the cannabis space. We are an online ordering platform connecting consumers with local retailers. So very similar to the same model as maybe an Uber Eats or my previous business at Grub Canada and online food ordering. Outside of obviously the courier, we can't do that in cannabis yet, but very, very parallel and very similar model.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, you guys kind of now know a little bit about each other. I'll kick it off with a simple question, and then really, happy for you two to lead the way. Allen, when Uber launched Uber Eats, you had a pretty incredibly successful, from a growth perspective, business that was dominating and doing really well and still continues to grow tremendously. What was the what became the impetus to be like, oh, let's also add this other complexity to what we're doing and get into kind of food delivery? Maybe take us through that journey, and then, Ross, I'll let you kind of take over and ask away.
Yeah, the starting point for Uber was we felt like we were building a logistics platform, and this idea of, you've got a consumer ingrained in the habit of going to their phone, hitting a button, and something happening in the real world for them. So how do you sort of turn that control, that consumer behavior that had changed, and the resources that an infrastructure that Uber had built, both on the product and operation side, into something that, started to allow the consumer to access more and really open up their city. And then from a business standpoint, there's really a small number of categories of things that you truly need right away. Uber had experimented with a couple of different on-demand type ideas, really as kind of like promotions for the core rides business for a long time. We did ice cream and kittens and like literally anything under the sun. I think there were car washes and a bunch of crazy stuff that happened all over the world, really, as city teams experimented. But in a focused effort, there was really only a handful of categories that are big enough and that you need right now. And that's really the aspect of logistics that Uber did well, right? It wasn't the sort of Amazon type routing where you load up a big vehicle and then go run some route. Rather, it was more about the sort of short routes, on demand right now type stuff. And the nature of prepared food being perishable lended itself to that. We obviously all eat multiple times a day. And so for that reason, it sort of became a logical place to experiment, though there were a lot of lessons along the way about what makes food delivery a really tough business, as I'm sure, Ross, you can speak to. I would summarize it simply as there's no angry, like I'm hungry and I'm angry or hangry. And so that leads to when the inevitable things go wrong, and there are lots of places in this process where it can break down. You can get some upset folks on the other end of the equation.
Absolutely. I share that same, I could say that with cannabis customer support, specifically dealing with coming from food, we've taken that and leveraged our experience in online food ordering in that sense. We saw it in the hardest way. There's nothing like dealing with a hangry customer, and also connecting something that we found that was difficult, especially back in the day. It might be different now that online ordering and consumer tech has really infiltrated brick and mortar in the way that it has through many platforms. Uber is one, Shopify is another, and there's a bunch in between. But for us, one of the difficulties was we found that it was bringing technology to people that didn't know what to do with technology. So we were knocking down doors in restaurants back in early mid 2000s, trying to explain to them what technology could do from them when they were just used to making and cutting up pizza and delivering it pretty easily. So it was a bridge that we had to bridging that gap between bringing technology to a restaurant that wasn't efficient with technology, and then getting that order efficiently to a customer that needs it at that moment in time right away, or else it all hits the fan and you deal with a customer support issue. We brought that experience to Dutchie, whereas although it's not as important and time sensitive to get your cannabis as like it is with food, if you could bring that level of if we bring that level where we set that bar in food to cannabis, customer support is always important no matter what industry you're in. So we strive to do that with response times and speed to order and speed to deliver. So all fun stuff. I got a question for you that comes to mind is, I think it's so interesting at scale. You were at Uber at a time, you went through what we're getting ready to go through. And I think a lot of the cannabis space is. So if we look and zoom out, the cannabis space is, let's say 5, give or take a couple of years, but about 5 years into the race, right? Legislation really caught underway in 2015, 16, 17. So we're through that first leg where the first few companies in tech specifically had that product market fit. And I think what we're learning and going through, and I want to hear from you, is there's a huge difference from an operator standpoint, from somebody in my seat or anybody at the company, of hitting that product market fit, that early on traction, where it's very much a hero-like company, whereas your CEO could do all the sales. You can have a few key players that really push the entire business, and moving from that product market fit into that scale up mode. The idea of being able to really now create an organization that runs the company instead of a few people, where you're creating support for your departments, where you're creating inroads from department to department to create cross-functional efficiencies. So I think that you had an interesting vantage point that, unlike anybody in the world, you saw, I think, the fastest growing company of all time from early on to through its scale up phase. So what was the difference? If I were to pinpoint my question, how do you keep culture intact when you're going through hiring as many people a week as you have in the company as a whole?
Yeah, I think that so Uber hired a lot of people. I think we had 5 years in a row where we doubled headcount year over year, which frankly just gets out of control at a certain point. But there's a few things that I think we learned in order to try to do that. The first is be really clear about what you're hiring for and what your values are. So to the extent that you can simplify and boilerplate your org structures, so you're not hiring for a bunch of different roles, you're just scaling out a lot of people in sort of the same profile. It brings efficiency to that. You start to really get comfortable with that profile, and you get really good at assessing it so that you're bringing in quality in those areas, and folks that are going to be able to communicate with each other. Two, knowing what sort of company values that you stand for. What are the attributes that make someone a good fit in your organization and in your environment? So things, on the Uber side, like, people from top to bottom being comfortable asking each other questions or bringing ideas to the table, right? Trying to be as flat of an organization as possible, really encouraging, innovation and hustle and problem solving from every corner of the organization, were examples of things that were values that were closely held in the organization, and then really almost sort of driven out through the interview process. We asked people to put their thoughts on paper and share their ideas so we could tell if someone was a creative problem solver. At times we might ask them to go do something in the real world. I remember our community manager, which was the marketing function, we'd ask them to, during the interview process, go ahead and get people signed up for Uber to test out how well they could do that, right? And so how can you sort of simulate what it's like to work there through the interview process, to give you a sense of kind of what you're getting, and also that person on the outside, a sense of what kind of organization they're joining to make as good of a match as you can. And I think the point that you made about, connecting people across the organization, I think is critical. And, this can be about how does function A work with function B? Because I think in these businesses that are highly regulated, that have a significant components of both operations and product, these are attributes of companies. And I think this is very true, likely in the cannabis space as well, where you can't get done something simply because one function wants to get it done. They need that partnership across functions. And so getting people aligned on, what you're trying to accomplish as a goal, and then making sure that you have the forums for those groups to connect with each other, the weekly meetings, the offsites, whatever it is that allows people to understand what each other is trying to accomplish. That connectivity, whether it's across function or whether it's across geography, as you start to scale out to, new markets, really then make sure that you wind up with something that ends up running like a single organization, not like a bunch of disparate parts glued together.
Yeah, on that topic. So something that I think is interesting to hear from you too is you're starting to see companies in cannabis now. There's a lot of opportunity in cannabis. It's a nascent industry, and nobody's really cornered any which part of it. There's definitely some category leaders arising for sure, but there's a lot of opportunity across the board. And I think a lot of these cannabis companies, I've always been a adamant and proponent of stay in your lane, pick one thing, do it perfect. I think these companies now are starting to get the itch to do more. And I think that's a natural feeling. It's still important to, I think, hold back and really make sure that you do have that core offering and product or service that you set out to, succeed on, really, really structured and well on its way. But you guys obviously did a phenomenal job with Uber on the rider driver side. You then moved into Uber Eats, and you were a big part of that initiative. How do you run at Uber? Did you see it as Uber Eats was a separate company, a startup within a huge organization? were there ways to dedupe and deduplicate efforts and departments that could do both? How did you leverage, Uber's exposure to push Uber Eats off outside of maybe a marketing side? So from more of an ops standpoint, as cannabis companies maybe look to start moving into another area, did you run the company as separate companies, Uber Eats separate from Uber rider and driver? And then, how did that work out?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I totally agree with your bias with, about keeping companies at the early stage simple. I think that, is it a Paul Graham quote about, more startups dying of indigestion than starvation, right? I think that there's, adding complexity to the business early, I think is something to be very cautious about. And, I would note that Uber was probably 5 or 6 years into the journey before Uber Eats, really came to be for that reason of focus. And when it was kind of brought into the organization after figuring out what path to take there, as I described before, it really was kind of siloed off to make sure that it wasn't a distraction to the existing teams. And so we really accepted some duplication in the early days in order to maintain focus between the teams. And so you build out a little bit heavier headcount function. There were probably some areas of connectivity that we missed. For example, from a product standpoint, initially, the food delivery business was kind of an additional button in the rider app. There was like a knife and fork at the top of the screen that you'd hit, and we got a lot of customer acquisition through that in the early days. But it started to become unwieldy, and the product roadmap was slowing down to be able to like fit it in, and like the app was just getting too big, and so we split it off, and we lost some customers through that. But it allowed for a faster innovation cycle, and then ultimately kind of glued the two pieces back together to create those pathways again. And now back in the product as of a year or two ago, you can kind of bounce between the two experiences. And so you kind of have to walk down that pathway from a product standpoint, from a customer messaging standpoint. So, who controls if a customer comes in from the rides business, on the one hand, you want to introduce them to this new product that you have. On the other hand, you want to be respectful of the way in which they came into the company and the thing that they were looking for. And so from a customer standpoint, it's important to be thoughtful about those touch points and not just overwhelming users with new services. And then lastly, kind of on the organizational side, Uber tried a structure initially where like a city GM that was running the rides business would also have kind of a dedicated Eats business team under them, and that single GM would take both. And again, we found that it was too much split focus. There wasn't enough kind of, subject matter specialty. If you're not waking up thinking about something that's a new business at that stage, it's going to get starved, right? Because it's at the beginning, it's 1% of your revenue, it's 5% of your revenue. And so if you really want to grow that to its potential, I think it's very difficult to ask a leader to spend equivalent time on something when the revenue mix is like a 95-5 kind of thing, right? You're incented to not do it that way. So I think you have to be really thoughtful about the organizational structures that you set up. And again, I think that sort of argues for doing it at the right time in your life cycle so that you feel comfortable with, investing a lot of money into something that's non-core and is going to be a longer term bet, or adding that organizational complexity at a time where focus might be the better choice for the company.
Yeah. So, something that's interesting right now with Corona is that we're all forced to work from home. And something that I've been focusing at Dutchie on is employee engagement and development. And, more now than ever. If we're looking at the optimistic or the light in the darkness, Corona has been a terrible thing for the world and has impacted all of us in many negative ways. However, being an optimist, and as we all are in business, we need to be. There is something positive for me that's come out of Corona. It really brought a spotlight, shed a lot of light, and brought the importance of employee engagement, to the surface and to a front seat. So you can't avoid it now. So we're right now really focused. We have a whole team focused on employee engagement and development. We're working a lot with keeping everybody's at home right now. Everybody's living on their computer. They're plugged in. They're living in a box within a box. And it's really, really difficult, but really important to keep everybody engaged as a team. And now something that I want to ask you, because Uber saw it in a different way. It wasn't in the earlier days, it wasn't a quarantine. It wasn't, everybody working from home necessarily. However, you guys did grow so fast that you ultimately and naturally had offices everywhere. You mentioned, even in different countries, and you were one that went from the States over to Asia. Then you launched new businesses like Uber Eats. So, in a funny way, you guys also kind of segmented and fragmented yourself. Similar to now, all of us aren't growing as fast as Uber, and no, we don't have tens of thousands of employees. But at the same time, even with 115 employees like Dutchie, we're dealing with a similar thing. So I want to ask, what were some of the things that you guys did to keep employees engaged? And to put a fun twist to it, what are some of the fun things that you guys did outside of just the boilerplate business stuff that you read out of the book? What were just some of the fun stuff? I'll start off. We do a virtual movie night once a month here at Dutchie. We do a virtual trivia where we create breakout rooms, and it's just fun. So I'm curious to learn. We do a virtual book club, for example, and it's things that are outside of work. It's not your typical stuff that you would think a normal, a job brings, but it's those things that bring employee engagement, really, really help with employee engagement. So I'm curious to learn, what are the fun things that Uber did to keep everybody engaged?
Yeah. And it's almost a new world, right? Like the idea of trying to do all this stuff virtually, because I grew up at Uber and we were big believers in getting people together physically. And so I think this has caused us to think in a new way. One of the things that we focused on was really the initial onboarding experience, right? So back to this idea of culture, right? So you can deliver culture and set that expectation with people as they go through a hiring process, but then they show up at day one, and we found that sort of retention was make or break in those first 6 months, and we had a period of time where we didn't do this very well, and so continued to emphasize it more. But we brought every employee, irrespective of where they were around the world, for I think the first 7 or 8 years of the company, to San Francisco in their first month or so, and ran what we called Uberversity, which was really this sort of indoctrination to the company and to the culture, right? So, when you're sitting outside of an HQ type situation, just picturing what HQ looks like, where, the executives are walking the halls, and the backdrop that you see for the monthly all hands meeting or whatever it is, like being physically a part of that builds this connective tissue that you kind of, struggle to build in any other way. And with my current company now with Ready, we just did our first offsite just last week. We're in the healthcare business and do COVID testing. So we had a whole COVID testing, thing as a part of that to be able to make it work. And I think with rapid tests now, this can be something that hopefully we're able to do more. But that idea of figuring out the ways that you get together in person, I think you threw out a lot of good ideas on the virtual side to create that connectivity. Because one of the things that I think we've all found is you just jump right into business when you jump on a Zoom, right? Versus like spending that time talking shop or whatever. So, I think striking that right balance and figuring out if there's a way to inject some of the in-person aspects, I think is something that is, as the world goes back to normal, certainly, but even before then, to sort of pick your spots, I think is super important.
Yeah, that totally resonates. Something that we just shifted. So we used to have an hour and a half long orientation, in person or not. If we have a fully distributed team now, density in Bend where our HQ is, but we're hiring, it's a remote first. And of course now everybody's remote, but hiring a distributed team, we employ over 25 states now. And we just shifted from an hour and a half orientation to a full day and a half. And it was it's been amazing. It cuts down on the ramp up time. It brings that warm, fuzzy feeling. It also breaks the ice. So, a lot of times if we think about it, your first time on a job, first day in a school, first day at camp, all those things, first day on a team, it's nerve wracking. And we all say that we're a family first. So, let's break the ice as fast as possible. So yeah. Totally resonates there. We found not only just success and business metrics, which are important, but at the end of the day, it's just fun. And it's like something that we lose in business too much. Yes, we're all in the business of making money. Let's be real. That's what keeps it keeps everything moving. But there's this aspect of fun that we have to index on. Which leads back to the business being successful. So totally resonate there and appreciate that. So
Ross, one of the things you said earlier that I was interested to kind of double back to before I lost it. You mentioned this idea of kind of bringing technology into restaurants, and that being such a a shift in the way that those business owners had operated before. I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective on bringing technology into the cannabis industry. I'm sort of fascinated from my experience at Uber, where we brought technology into the limousine industry or the taxi industry that clearly had not invested there, and then doing that again into restaurants where a restaurateur has to be good at 1,000 things, and technology may or may not be one of those. I'm doing that in the healthcare space now. Cannabis is kind of its own beast as well. From your kind of career journey, what have you seen, and where does cannabis sit on that spectrum of, kind of technology adoption when you look at the businesses that Dutchie works with?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I've learned, if I were to summarize one lesson, it's that, you have majority of tech minds think the same in one way, shape, or another. And when you start moving into a non-tech space, restaurants back in the day, even dispensaries right now, don't get me wrong, dispensaries are extremely tech savvy. In 2020, a lot of operators are, no matter what industry you are in. However, the way of the tech mind and the roadmap of tech and the ops and the processes that majority of tech companies run and hinge on is very different than the offline world, right? So I think that it's what's really important is to feel the customer and really take a step into their shoes to understand what they're going through. Because what you think and what is right for tech doesn't make it right for their business. And they're the client at the end of the day. They know, the limousine driver knows what it's like to drive a limousine far better than Uber does. Far better. Now, it's important to humble yourself there and have that vulnerability to listening to somebody and adopting some of their ways, even if they're counterintuitive to scaling tech. Right. So a lot of times we see a great story of Airbnb doing things that don't scale early on. And I'm sure Uber has a lot of these situations, and we do too at Dutchie, where with Airbnb, I think the kind of famous story is they couldn't rely on the hosts to take photos of their apartments, their spaces, their living spaces. It wouldn't make for that jaw-dropping consumer experience when going to Airbnb. So they took it into their own hands and set out to accomplish an impossible feat that doesn't scale, which is we're going to just send photographers everywhere and take photos. And that was the reason why one of the reasons why it helped them get off the ground and their go-to-market strategy was successful. Probably similar with Uber and food, even on the photo side, like Absolutely. Taking photos of food, Yeah. And funny enough, we'll keep that.
There's a big difference in how a pizza looks when I take the photo versus somebody that actually knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. And then the same thing with cannabis. You can't rely on dispensaries to take photos of the products. So that's a perfect example. We'll kind of lean and double click right there. In cannabis, when we first started off, we thought, well, let's send light boxes out to all the dispensaries. They'll take photos of the products. They have 500 to 1,000 products on each menu. And they're turning over so fast. There's no way we're going to take photos. We can't go to all the stores. We can't even send photographers out, unlike Airbnb did. And we quickly learned that, it's not the dispensary's strong suit, and that we're not comfortable relying on them to do something that they're not experts at, that, could lead to our success or, our failure. So what we did was we built an internal content team that works with all the brands and have cataloged now over 200,000 products in the cannabis space. So I think in summary, and to kind of circle back to the question, is really, really understanding that there is a gap and we need to bridge it, but we need to meet in the middle. And, these are people that come from a totally different style of work, that brick and mortar, that offline mode. And we need to bridge that. And the companies that are able to do that, it's a very difficult challenge, but the companies that are able to do it find a lot of success. Shopify, Uber, what we're going after right now. So it's something to, instead of just listening, I think that if I were to boil it down to one sentence, and don't just listen to your customers, feel it, go there. Customer intelligence is key. And to stay humble, to know that you know what you know, but more importantly, know what you don't know. And Uber Eats does not know how to run a restaurant like the restaurateurs do. They know how to run a tech platform. There are going to be a lot of counterintuitive things to tech that we do have to, satisfy in order scale our tech. So it's something that it's a constant struggle too. And I think I'll add to that, being a constant struggle, what got us here is not going to get us there, right? So it's to constantly be challenging that status quo and our level of thinking and our process, our framework, to know that we have to evolve and adapt.
Yeah, and I think there's an important scale question as you think about the sequence of this too, right? This idea of doing things that fundamentally don't scale at the beginning and not being afraid to go do that, to invest in, a set of boots on the ground, to invest in, sending the right camera out or whatever it is to kind of capture the experience that you need. But then sort of the essence of scaling is beginning to recognize the right point at which you begin to put more process around that, or you need to flip something from, being owned within the operations vertical to, okay, it's time to invest our product teams focus on something that enables our internal teams to be more efficient. We had this for a long time at Uber, where our operations managers who manage the drivers were just in, we called it moving from a mechanic to a fighter pilot, because they were just hand-to-hand combat, sending out text messages out of their personal phone, calling up guys, reconciling Excel sheets, all these kind of things that you just knew at the growth curve you were headed at was going to require some massive investment in people, and it's just going to start to break and get clunkier and clunkier. And I think, spotting those things, being comfortable living in that environment long enough that you can focus product resources on the things that the product needs to be doing, serving the customers and enabling growth, while making sure that at the right point you inject product back in to building the internal system so that all your people don't quit, or they are able to get that leverage to be able to move on to higher value activities. That sequencing becomes really important on how you invest internally versus externally, and when something lives in kind of operations, manual, just get it done realm, to, okay, we need to start putting some polish and some automation to it.
Yeah. And that's interesting. It's exactly where the cannabis space is right now. Where a lot of these companies, especially cannabis tech companies, are getting to a level of, hit product market fit, are getting ready to scale. They're starting to see high volume come in, and you got to always check yourself, right? Whether it's a refactor of some code or a rewrite, or investing in infrastructure to just support your support, right? Not just external, but more focusing on internal. It's something that we're focusing a lot at here at Dutchie. It's, if we're confident in the future, let's build for the future. Let's not just build for today. And it's definitely a shift in mindset. How I've looked at my analogy is in cannabis is it's a very nuanced space. We deal with regulations that are fragmented, and a nascent industry that's very new, and everybody's figuring it out, right? It's all uncharted territory for all players combined, right? So one thing that I say is, being how nuanced this space is, I feel like since when we started Dutchie just over 3 years ago, we've been swimming from the depths of the ocean floor up to the surface, but with weights on our ankles. And the cannabis space and the nuances of regulations and state by state and all the changes that happen on a dime in our space, those are the weights. And I think it's important for us, for the first time, I feel like we've finally gotten to a position and feel comfortable. It's more just of a mindset. It's not how many dispensaries we have. It's not how much capital we've raised. It's not how big the team is. It's more of the mindset of, let's get to the surface and look now in the future. Instead of fighting to save every little piece of the business for today, and let's get to the surface, be comfortable with where we're at right now, and now let's look forward. Let's look for the future state. Let's go 5 years, 10 years out. What is Dutchie going to be like then? That's how we're thinking. What is your company going to be like in the future? And then to go back, start building that infrastructure there. If you know you're going to build a skyscraper, you can't do it with wood, and you know that you need your foundation set in stone, and really spend majority of the time on the foundation so you can build it up, or else it obviously comes back to bite you. So it's definitely something that's top of mind, and I hope for most cannabis tech companies right now, as we now all move into this new phase of growth.
I was going to ask one more question on that, Ross. This idea of sort of building foundation and investing in the today and the existing business as compared to future opportunities. And I think this can present itself in a bunch of different ways, right? We talked about this idea of adding new business lines earlier. You can always invest deeper into the current experience you have versus building, new features or something like that. And given the regulatory regime in cannabis, the idea to sort of move into a new state and geographic expansion is probably not something to be taken lightly. And, there's immense opportunities in California, but, maybe more greenfield opportunities in new states as they come online. How have you guys made some of those trade-off decisions? Do you have like a heuristic for that? Do you separate out teams for like current versus future stuff? How have you tried to navigate that as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. And California is a great example, and I'll use that to speak on. Everybody saw California. It's the most populated state in the country. It's got the highest adoption for cannabis. It was very much a shiny state and a huge opportunity. What we did was we took a step back and we said, well, with all that said, we think that most of our competitors and most players will gravitate there, and it's going to be a highly competitive market. In a unique sense here, and in other industries, in most industries, in fact, I think that the first to move advantage is not as strong as the world perceives it to be. In fact, I think there's more of an advantage to being the second to move because you've learned from the first mistakes, right? In fact, Uber probably wasn't the first ride sharing company. And sometimes, so when you're the first to move, you're tasked with having to first educate, which is really timely and expensive. And then you're there to figure it out and learn, which inevitably, naturally will bring a lot of problems, which lead to some potential churn situations. Whereas then the second player to move in doesn't have to educate. The value is already provided to the customer or the client, to the opportunity. And you could see the mistakes that were made and maybe smooth them out. So for us, we took a step back and we moved strategically. Actually, we didn't move into cannabis, into California. We saw a strategic play of let's go focus on more emerging states where they're not as competitive, where we can have a strong hold. And let's let California kind of figure itself out and mature a little bit more. So their processes are more dialed. They're educated, and there's other factors that came into play too. Like, for example, even Metric, the seed to sale tracking system, was slower to roll out in California. So we knew that, for example, and to get granular and specific with it, that the inventories wouldn't be spot on because they weren't reporting to the state. And therefore us depending on inventory being accurate, it's gonna harm our business. So I think it's really important to take a step back, to utilize first principles, right? And to not just go where you're supposed to or you should go. The word should is a terrible word in life and in business, right? Like, let's always challenge the status quo, right? If we could have, usually a dollar equals a dollar, and let's talk about how efficient it is to get there, and then the value of that dollar, and then the opportunity to retain, like, what's our success at retaining that dollar or making that dollar worth more. So yeah, definitely to question what everybody else is thinking. And now with that said, so we feel like we have that granular domain knowledge of specifically e-commerce in the cannabis space. So it's to be confident there, but also to listen to everybody around and assess the situation as a whole. Don't just jump in. Speed to market's important, but you got to be, speed with the right mindset and framework to make that decision is just as important. You can run fast at anything and blow up quickly. So it's definitely take that half step back when assessing that.
This is really cool, and I'm loving this conversation, and I know you guys could continue on this path for a while. I wanted to throw a little topic in there, and I'd love to get both of your opinions because, Ross, you're doing it out of a seat as the decision maker, and Allen, in many instances, I'm sure you were too, but there were other senior people making some of these decisions. Let's talk about burn, right? Uber historically was very criticized for how much burn kind of undertook. I'm curious to understand sort of how you felt about it, how you feel about it now, Allen, and then let's turn that back to Ross as kind of in this process now. You just raised a large round. You're sitting on a lot of cash. I'm sure there's like as the operator, a lot of desires of where to spend that money and spend it a lot. So I'm just curious to hear how you guys, Allen, how you've thought about it as someone who was in there and obviously part of a lot of those decisions, but also had a little bit of the audience view of how Uber was handling it. And then, Ross is someone who's going to make these decisions. So, spicing it up a little bit. Go ahead, Allen.
Yeah. So, I think Uber, historically, has raised and spent historic amounts of capital in sort of the first 8 to 10 years of the company's life ahead of IPO. And I think, some of that was a function of the global ambitions, right? As you expand your field of play geographically, as you expand your field of play from a business line standpoint, those obviously are capital consuming. And I think the company sort of did that more conservatively in the early days. And then as the momentum and the narrative built and the investor understanding of the space grew, and thus the amount of capital that was available, investment in different components of the business expanded commensurately. So there was sort of that part that I think was thoughtful and staged well, and really controlled. I think in that space in particular, there were probably fewer barriers to entry than we thought at the beginning. And kind of a, generational type opportunity related to this just like, really $1 trillion plus type market opportunity that led to a lot of people flooding into the space and a lot of kind of non-traditional capital that had never, really stepped into these spaces before. Right? You're talking about auto manufacturers investing in tech companies, right? That's been not historically the norm. And so with those pools of capital, then, it became about how do you spend it to show some sort of growth. And that's where a lot of the inefficiency flooded in. And so I think, it wasn't about necessarily investing in like engineers to build the product. It was about, kind of a direct wealth transfer from VCs to, riders and drivers in hyper competitive markets. And I'm not sure anybody really, aside from the riders and drivers, ultimately benefited from that. And so that, that was the piece that, I don't think anybody was particularly happy to be living in that world. It was a function of the world, right? And in some ways we felt like the more successful we were, the more capital that sort of came into the space behind that. And so with that, you can't control that aspect, but you control how you deploy the dollars. And so we spent a lot of time looking at technology solutions and planning solutions and, innovation to try to deploy each dollar in the most effective way possible, taking a really rigorous and quantitative view to it. Though I think at times we sort of miss the idea that, there might be some simpler things that weren't about optimizing the most immediate unit, but were more about engendering loyalty with customers and with drivers that I think probably would have been larger investments upfront, but much smaller investments over the long run, I think was a big lesson. So, I think to maybe summarize some of that, one, kind of understand what the capital environment around the space is and make sure that you're operating commensurate to that, right? Because that's going to set the expectation of how easy it is to raise capital, what the investor expectations are for, using that to, show growth versus show paths to profitability and efficient use of capital. So I think it's one, two, really be rigorous about the dollars that you spend, right after you raise a round is the best time, in my opinion, to go about, putting efficiency initiatives in place, because no one can misconstrue that for, oh, we're about to run out of money, so that's why we're getting efficient. No, we just raised a bunch of money, and now is the best time to get efficient to make sure that lasts as long as possible. And then I think the last thing is, sort of appropriately take quantitative and qualitative approaches to that idea of efficiency, right? Where you're investing money in a recurring basis, where can you use quantitative approaches to make sure that, if you're investing for growth in market A and market B, or product A and product B, you're sort of doing that on the most efficient way to achieve that outcome, but also stepping back and going, where are investments that we need to make that are softer, right? In customers, in brand, in employees, those things that kind of drive long-term value, that may feel like they're the easier line items to cut, but actually are the wrong line items to cut.
Yeah, I'll add and take a step back. Those are a lot of, there's like deploying capital at scale, and Alan, you touched a lot on that. Let's take a step back. I'm going to say this to Karan, a VC in the cannabis space. This is don't get mad at me for saying this, Karan, but I think that it's interesting. So back to the should, the word that shouldn't be in the dictionary. Most people think that raising a round of capital is successful. It means you're successful. And it's such a false statement. A lot of people always congratulate you on raising a round of financing. And now that's great. Raising a round of financing is a very difficult task. You run a marathon, you get sent through the ringer by, very intelligent groups that are really,
funny. I can hear the your brain working of trying to use the appropriate synonym for what you really want to say. That's fine.
Yeah, when raising money through Casa Verde, it's not that difficult, but no, I'm just joking. No. So it's really important though to take a step back and to know that when you enter the venture track, it's a double-edged sword. And just raising capital and spending capital like at scale is not for every business or every person. So I think before you make that leap, don't just go based on all the successful companies raised a boatload of capital, right? There's more to it than that. And raising a round of financing is not a milestone of success like the world perceives it to be. If anything, it's the opposite. You've set the valuation higher, you've set the bar higher, and you should have a little bit of anxiety around that. So I think first and foremost is to make that decision. There are definitely different ways to win the race, right? It's, if you will, the rabbit, the turtle and the hare, right? So the tortoise and the hare. So now if you're going to raise, a round of capital, which we've done, we're on a similar track, as maybe Uber went, which is let's raise as much capital as we can. Let's deploy fast. We've raised 53 million to date in the first 3 years. And we want to continue to accelerate from here. We couldn't go fast enough is how I feel. Now that maps to me. That's my energy. That's my style. And that's how our culture here at Dutchie, but that's not for everybody. So first and foremost, it's there. It's make sure that we understand that there is a double-edged sword there, right? Outside of just the dilution, but more so in the spirit of how you have to move now that you've raised the capital. For us, now that we've raised the capital, let me take a step back. There's one other thing that I think is important to note that I've learned, and especially it's reinforced with Alan, you talking about it. Uber is one of the most successful companies of our day. And I think if you line up 10, 20, 100 people that have raised and you ask that question that Karan asked, everybody has a different answer and nobody's done it perfectly. Everybody has made more mistakes than anybody would imagine, right? And the reality is most people don't get to hear that about companies like Uber or Instacart or DoorDash or Lyft. It seems like from the public eye that it's just this fast growing, successful company, when in reality, behind closed doors, like anything in life, there's a lot
everything's messy. Yeah.
Yeah. And that everybody and you and your team before Uber were similar to the people maybe listening to this that are thinking, do I start a company? Do I raise capital? Everybody has to figure it out. And it's all uncharted territory. It's something that we're really focusing on Dutchie. And I say it on our orientation is, hey, let me break it to you. None of us know what we're doing. That's just a fact. And if we don't feel that way, that's naive. So we're all here to learn. We're all here to learn off of everybody. And it's a cumulative effort that gets it done, not just a dictatorship where one person knows and lays down the law. So I think it's important to have that mindset, that to not strive for perfection, to be okay making mistakes, because inevitably you will when spending and when raising and spending capital, when budgeting. So, for us, what it comes down to is to first look at the far end, the TAM, the total addressable market. What's the opportunity here? You brought up, and you were fortunate to be able to bring up the word trillion. We're not there, but we do see it as an extremely sizable opportunity. And our confidence level of going the distance and what we've set out to achieve maps to that. So we know that the juice is worth the squeeze, and it's going to be really sweet if we get there. Now, I think it's like similar to climbing Everest, though, right? Like it's going to be extremely difficult. Some may die along the way, but if you get to the top, and are you willing to have that, or do you have that confidence, and are you willing to roll the dice? It's a risk. It's a gamble that Karan on the VC side makes, and it's just as much a gamble that us operators of the company have to make, right? We're investing, you invested in Uber. Whether it's not your dollar, it's your time, and it's the same thing. And whether it's an employee, a CEO, a founder, or an investor, it's all the same. So it's not to strive for perfection. It's to understand the opportunity. If you're confident in the opportunity and you go for it, then to stick with that level of confidence, because once you're on the track, you're on the track. You can't really step off, right? So it's now be smart. Let's look at our economics. Let's understand our CAC, our customer acquisition costs. Let's understand the lifetime value of the customer. Let's make sure that the formulas make sense, so we're not just spraying, praying, and throwing blind darts at the wall. But if they do make sense, then it is sometimes worth, and in our sense it is, and in Uber's sense it was, let's roll the dice, let's gamble, let's be aggressive, and let's go for it. I say, set your goals astronomically high, right? That leaves for room for growth and opportunity. And if you fall short of that, which inevitably most of us will, that's okay. So it's definitely get rid of the should, really understand what raising capital and spending capital at that rate really means. And then having the mindset going forward that you're not going to strive for perfection. It's not going to happen. You're going to make mistakes along the way. And when they happen, to use them as a lesson, not just a mistake. But then if the formula and economics make sense, then by all means, and we're doing it here at Dutchie, and you did it at Uber, is, go for gold and be aggressive, because if it's for you, then that's all that's what's going to satisfy you. So.
I like that answer. And then Allen, I really liked what you said about, sort of immediately after a raise is this kind of ideal time to have those kind of efficiency conversations. And it makes a ton of sense. And I think one of the things, Dutchie, you guys have done really well, is kind of live by that. And you've always been prepared and looking towards the future. And even the timing of, as you've done things, I think has been really intelligent. So I would ask one more thing. I know maybe we were running a little short on time, but I'm really interested in it. Again, the dynamic is pretty interesting. Like Allen, obviously, like you were a leader at Uber, you built and ran multiple teams, multiple business units, et cetera. But also you were an employee and you had like a pretty, charismatic leader in Travis when you initially joined. Obviously lots on him, and he became a very big public figure over the course of Uber's history. I guess, like, talking to Ross in this moment, thinking about, when Uber was there sort of similarly, what are the kind of traps to watch out for, especially as a leader of a high growth business? And, what lessons can he learn both on the shoulds and shouldn't, Ross's favorite word, from your experience and having been there in, like I said, like a truly unique seat that most people don't get the opportunity to be in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say on this front is I've never been a CEO, and it's a super hard job from everything that I can tell watching it. It's lonely at the top, and I think every leader feels that way at certain times, and that's the top seat. I think there's a few things that I've heard Ross say today that I really like. This idea of sort of humbleness and admitting what you don't know, and setting that culture where, everybody can bring their ideas to the table. I think that was something that Travis did an incredible job of, is setting a culture that, really from top to bottom, great ideas could come from anywhere. It was a core value of the company. And I think it's one of the reasons that people joined, one of the reasons that people stayed, because it felt so different than the majority of places that people work that feel super hierarchical. And it's super it's much easier to do that when there's 5 of you and there's 50 of you than when there's 500 or 5,000. And so truly the job of the leader on culture is to think about how you scale that culture. And from the number of questions and comments that you made, Ross, around that, I can tell it's something that's heavy on your mind and something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, because, in the kinds of businesses that we're in, we're kind of only as good as our team. These are knowledge type businesses. And so, attracting great people, retaining them, making them feel valued and motivated, I think is a core leadership goal, and something that I was, kind of privileged to see under in a couple of different ways. Everybody has their own style around that, and that's okay. But I think that's a super critical area. And then, I think the other idea is really, having this clear direction for your team. Where is it that you're headed? I've kind of heard this mantra. The CEO's job is make sure you have money, make sure you hire the right team, and set the strategy. And that might be it, right? Like if you could do those three things well as a CEO, then you're doing all the right things. And I think that's kind of naturally where the comments of the conversation have flowed today. So I think that there's a lot that's really, really good in that. The rest of it becomes about, how do you listen to people, and then how do you ultimately step in and be decisive, because decision making is obviously a key part of this. So, it's been great to spend the time today, Ross, and I really look forward to kind of watching where Dutchie goes from here. It's clear you guys are on an awesome trajectory. Yeah,
likewise. And I appreciate Growth for setting this up, Karan, for being on top of this and connecting Allen and I. And Allen, appreciate the insights. It's invaluable.
Guys, very cool. Thank you for taking the time. And it was just truly a pleasure to watch. And as I expected, this could easily have been a 3-hour conversation, and maybe one day it will be when I'm sure Ross.
Yeah, let's just do that in person instead of Zoom.
Yeah. Let's hope we can do that in person soon. Awesome. All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.